We are ready to get started. I want to thank all of you for joining today. My name is Jennifer Morris. I'm with MadCap Software. Joining me today is Matthew Ellison, certified MadCap Flare consultant and instructor, director of UA Europe, accomplished thespian, frequent speaker at conferences all over the world, including MadWorld, and he happens to be one of my favorite educators, someone I've learned so much from over the years. I'm just so delighted that you're joining us today. Welcome, Matthew. Today, Matthew is going to talk about micro content. What is this thing? Why is it important for content developers to understand? We'll touch on the new micro content editor in MadCap Flare 2019, including how we can utilize micro content right out of the box and its positive impact on your users, and touch on other use cases for micro content and things to be mindful of as we do that. So we have a lot to cover today. So I want to cover just a few quick items of business before we begin. So as a friendly reminder, this presentation will be recorded. And if you could just advance the slide,
Sure.
Matthew, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, so again, this webinar will be recorded. We will email it out to everybody who's registered. So if you need to cut out early, not to worry, you'll get a link to the recording. There is a questions area in the GoToWebinar console. I encourage you to type in any questions that you have. We're going to do our best to get to them today while you're on with us. But whatever we don't get to, we'll be sure to compile a list of questions and answers for everybody that signed up and sent them out. So feel free to jot them down there. So again, as I mentioned, we have so much to cover. Want to welcome you again, Matthew. Thank you so much for taking the time with us, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. And that was a lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thanks for inviting me to do this webinar. Jen noticed, by the way, when we were talking a few minutes ago, she noticed some bird song in the background. I'm sitting in my garden or backyard, as you call it in the States, in a wooden cabin. It's a very warm day, so I've got the windows open, and I do have birds singing right outside the window. So if you hear bird song, it's not happening in your head. There really is bird song right outside my window. So I hope it doesn't distract you too much. Right, here's my agenda for this session. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about micro content and what it is, a little bit of background information, and then some of the ways in which you can use it. It's good to know what it's for before we actually start creating it. And then we'll work in Flare. Or, well, actually, I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to work in Flare. I have worked in Flare, and I've created a lot of screenshots of me working in Flare. So I'm going to stick with my PowerPoint presentation and just show you screenshots. If we have any spare time at the end, I might go into Flare and do some live stuff. But I'm going to keep it safe until then. In a way, this is actually a taster for a presentation that I'm going to be giving later in the year. I'm actually going to be presenting at MadWorld in Dublin. And I promise I'll do some live demos at that session if you come along to that. Anyway, so we're gonna create some micro content in Flare, and then I'm going to show you I guess the most important use of micro content, certainly the most important use of micro content within Flare, is using it to improve search results, and get your users much more quickly to the information they need. And then finally, I'm going to say a little bit about how micro content also has uses outside of Flare, and how we can still use Flare as the tool to create that micro content. So let's get started. I said I'd talk about what micro content is, and I from the research I've done, as far as I can tell, the phrase was originally coined by Jakob Nielsen, who I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of. He's a huge web usability guru. He's been around for quite a few years now, still around. And I think he originally coined the term when he was talking about the usability of web pages, of pages on the web, probably 10 or 15 years ago. And what he meant by it was the fact that when you're looking through long pages of web content, users are actually on the lookout for key pieces of information, things like headings, summaries, and descriptions. So his original definition related to that, but I've read he's posted more recently on this. This was an article from 2017, and his current definition is a type of UX copywriting in the form of short text fragments or phrases, often presented with no additional contextual support. And then I think probably more helpfully, he says it communicates key messages in a concise form, and I'd certainly agree with that. And in fact, well, here are some advantages of the kind of things he talks about. I'll tell you my preferred definition in just a moment. So you can see some of these things are micro content in the context of long pages, where titles, as we know, are very important, and headings are very important. As people scan through long pieces of content, they're looking for this micro content as ways, as indicators as to what's going to be really useful to them. Email subject lines. I get really annoyed when people send me emails without a subject line, because I rely on that little bit of micro content to tell me, do I need to read this now? What's it about? And when I'm referring back to emails, it's really useful to have that little bit of micro content to tell me what the email was about. So my definition is a way of providing quick answers to questions. You know what? I used to define help topics themselves as being answers to questions. But there's been a trend in recent years with some help topics getting a bit longer than they used to be. Some people write help information or information, web-based information, HTML-based information as quite long-form content. I suppose you could describe them as articles almost, rather than the sort of mini help topics that we used to write perhaps 15 years ago. So that's why perhaps micro content is becoming more important, because they are taking on this role of providing the very quick answer that someone really needs. How do I do this? Maybe it's just 4 or 5 steps they need. They don't need any background information, any introduction, any of the details. They just want that really quick little small nugget of information. And that's what micro content can deliver. This is a great definition. Sorry, I screenshotted this out of a web page, and I'll give you the URL in a minute. I mean, this kind of says it all. That micro content is quick. That's the whole point of it. It's something you consume in just a few seconds. If you want to check out that page, there's the link. And these slides will be available to you afterwards, so you can check out all my references. So what can we use micro content for within our user assistants? Well, there are some uses outside of the context of Flare. So I suppose this is kind of user assistance in a much broader scope. Again, there's a trend these days towards users getting information in a wide variety of ways, and chatbots are becoming very, very important and popular. They're driven by artificial intelligence, but basically they need a script. And chatbots, when it comes down to it, are responding to questions and providing kind of canned bits of information, short bits of micro content. So often what we have with a chatbot is a kind of a relationship between a question and a response to that question. And that's the kind of content we can create in Flare, and then give to a developer who's responsible for the chatbot, and they can pull in our content and use it within the chatbot. They may have to transform that content. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. FAQs is another very popular way in which users find answers to questions. A lot of mobile applications these days don't have full-blown help. What they do have is a set of FAQs, set of answers to questions. And again, there's this sort of pairing between a question and a response, an answer. And we'll have a look at an example of one of those. And I suppose going even more off away from our sort of traditional help systems is VR or augmented AR, augmented reality applications, where again those applications need a script. They need the text, often in very short little pieces to instruct users as they work within a virtual reality environment. And finally, a little bit more old school, I suppose, the idea of field level help, context sensitive help, little bits of help that appear within the user interface of an application. So that couldn't be done using a traditional Flare HTML5 top nav output. What we need there is those little pieces of information again to slot into the UI. So we can use this new micro content feature in Flare for authoring all of these things. However, in all cases, it doesn't work kind of completely out of the box. What MadCap provides is a way of creating the content, nice rich content, and then outputting it as standard XHTML, and your developers would then pick that up and work with it and then integrate it into whatever system they were using. What we can do within Flare, and this is the really exciting bit, and I never use the word exciting, without really meaning it. I am quite excited about this. The idea of using what are called featured snippets. Now, this is a slightly confusing term in the context of Flare, because when we talk about featured snippets in relation to micro content, we're not referring to Flare's normal snippets. We're not referring to the snippet feature that we've had in Flare for a long, long time. In fact, featured snippets is a term that was originally invented by Google and used in Google search. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. But before I get onto that, I mentioned chatbots. Here's a nice example. I'm a user of Slack these days. I'm working on a project now where all my communication is done using Slack, and I was really impressed with the bot within Slack, the Slack bot, which enabled me to ask questions, and it would come back with some really useful key bits of information. Of course, I'm lazy. I don't really ask questions, so I needed to join a channel, so I just typed join channel, and Slackbot responded with some information about, yes, it's a good idea, and this is how you do it. And this was its response to channel. So it's kind of interesting to see the different ways in which chatbots respond to different questions, but it's driven by artificial intelligence, but ultimately these are just little chunks of content which are being pulled out of a database and presented to the user. So this is the kind of thing we can create using Flare. So there's the question and response pairing that I was talking about. I mentioned FAQs. I didn't have to look far for some examples of FAQs. I use WhatsApp. There's a lot of FAQs on the WhatsApp website. I quite like the way they're presented. People are doing much better job of FAQs these days. And the first thing is that they're not actually necessarily phrased as questions, which never seemed to me the best way the most sort of well-structured way to present a list of possible questions. So what they've done is organized the information into sort of different subject areas, and then within verification I can find out if I want to know about two-step verification or using WhatsApp on multiple phones. I can just click one of those two items. So these are the kind of in inverted commas questions, even though they're not phrased as questions. And if I did select the two-step verification one, then I see some micro content. It's quite rich micro content. It actually includes a video. and it includes some instructions, but it's still not a very long piece of content. It goes a little bit further. I had to scroll down when I was seeing this live to see it all, but it's no more than a couple of screens worth of information. So it's not going to take me more than a minute to read this. And I have to admit, this example of a virtual reality screen I took straight out of MadCap's help. I'm not an expert on either virtual or augmented reality, but again, you see the little pieces of information that are embedded within the augmented reality environment, which can be provided from Flare if we author it in Flare. And here's my example of field level help. Thought I'd give you a sort of bit of European glamour in this screenshot. So I was looking at booking a flight from London to Amsterdam, and I had the option here to show flexi flares. And this is the obvious question: is what are flexi flares? I quite like the question there being embedded into the UI. And if I click on that results in a bit of micro content being displayed. So again, we have the question response pairing. Now your question might be, well, why would we use Flare to create that micro content? Why don't we just use a text editor, or why don't we have our developers create it? Why don't we use Word? And there's a couple of reasons, two really good reasons, in fact. The first reason is that it would make sense if we could reuse some of the micro content that we use outside of Flare from within the topics that we write with Flare. And in fact, it's going to happen the other way round, that what we're actually going to do is take bits of content we've already written in our long form topics and extract them and create micro content from them. But either way, we want reuse, we want single sourcing, so that if we change the content in our long form topic, it's going to automatically change in our micro content. And that makes sense. That's going to save us a lot of time. And the second thing is that Flare is a great tool for creating content. We just saw a minute ago that example of the WhatsApp frequently asked question response included a video, and Flare's quite capable of creating rich content with embedded images, multimedia. We can use variables, which again gives us good reuse of content, makes it easy to change product names, that kind of thing. And we can even do responsive layouts in Flare. So Flare, it's just a great authoring tool. So why not use it to create those bits of micro content, even if they're not going to end up living, or not just living, within our Flare help topics. All right, now we come to the really interesting bits and the bits where you can do a lot within Flare itself, using micro content within Flare. So when we've created the micro content, we're going to see how it can really improve the search results, or augment the search results anyway, and allow people to get to the information they need much more quickly. And as I mentioned this term featured snippets a few minutes ago. This whole way of improving search results is based on the same technique, the same concept that Google have been using for a few years now. And the concept itself is called featured snippets. Although there isn't really, as I say, don't confuse this term with Flare's snippets. They're not the same thing. Featured snippets is just a sort of general term for the technique that we're going to be using to use our micro content in our search results. So let's look at the background of this. Let's have a look at what Google are doing with featured snippets to see if this can give us some ideas about kinds of things we can do within Flare. Well, just a bit of background on Google's micro content. The whole idea of featured snippets and micro content and improving search results kind of dates back about 7 years now, to 2012, when Google announced they were investing in this new technology called the knowledge graph, which is a huge database of not just words, because what's happening is we're moving away from just a full text search engine, but a database of concepts, that Google, the search engine, actually understands. So this enables Google, instead of just providing a full text search engine, to give you much more relevant and meaningful results based on an understanding of your intent and what you're asking. So as a simple example, before 2012, if you'd searched on famous movie stars, Google would probably have just seen the fact you typed 3 words and would have shown you pages that had each of those 3 words. And so you might have ended up with, information about heavenly bodies, stars in the sky, because that's what a star is. If you search for famous movie stars now, Google recognizes that phrase as representing a concept and will give you information about movie stars and list a whole, give you pictures of Brad Pitt and others. It actually understands what you mean by famous movie stars. And that's all because of the knowledge graph. And it is huge now. I don't have any more recent figures than 2016, but in 2016 it held 70 billion or more than 70 billion facts. Now, one of the things that's possible as a result of this huge investment in knowledge graph is to give you better, more useful results, and to make those results a lot more prominent. So what a featured snippet is it's intended to be a summary of an answer to a user's query. So in other words, what Google is doing is, based on what you type into the search box, it's trying to work out what you mean, what you're asking for, what your intent is, and to give you the best possible summarized answer at what they call, or what's known as position 0, which really means right at the top, #1 search result. So I dug this out of the support that Google provide for webmasters. This is sort of a graphical representation of what a featured snippet is, a little boxed bit of content displayed at that position 0 at the top of search results. And there are 3 types. I didn't know this until I've kind of been using feature snippets for many years and benefiting from them, but I haven't really sat down and analyzed them and thought about them until now. So it's kind of interesting to know that most of the feature snippets you see are just text paragraphs, but there are also special ones which provide lists, often numbered steps, giving you telling you how to do something, and some actually give you tables. And by the way, the way it works is, the way these snippets work is that Google will do its normal search. It'll come up with a list of results. It'll look at the top few results. I think it's the top 10, and it'll work out which of those top 10 results is the best candidate for extracting a featured snippet from. And a featured snippet is not a piece of content that Google's created. A featured snippet is actually content that Google is taking out of pages on the web and just placing it in this box at the top. So as I say, what happens when you do a search, you get some results. Google will look at those top 10 results, and if one of those really is a great candidate for a featured snippet, and it won't necessarily be the top result, it won't be the #1 result necessarily, because there might be a result a little bit further down which has a little bit richer metadata, which allows Google to more easily or more confidently create a useful featured snippet. Then it will extract that content and display it in the featured snippet at the top. So this is not, featured snippets is not content that Google is creating. It's content that Google is collating out of pages, content which is already on the web. Let's have a look at some examples, including a couple of examples I just saw today as part of my everyday work. I've become much more aware of them now and how they're helping me. So here's the first example. If you search on boil an egg, then you'll see a featured snippet right at the top of search results, which gives you a nice, succinct sort of 6-line summary of how to boil an egg, and then provides a link to the topic from which that little piece of micro content has been distilled. Nice picture of an egg as well, which I think has come from another web page. So it's pulling together information from different sources and creating that little snippet there. And there's also some questions underneath that I can get answers to that relate to boiling an egg. Here's another sort of more practical one, a more techie one. What if you need to install a sim? Well, I guess what Google's done here is they've kind of find out what is the most popular, most frequently searched procedure. The Apple iPhone 5, I guessed, must still be one of the most frequently used phones where people are trying to insert sims. So here we go. Here they've pulled in the 4-step. So this is a list type featured snippet they've distilled out of Verizon Wireless's website with a little picture as well. Interestingly, this is the featured snippet you get is very, very sensitive to the exact wording that you type in. What I found was if you type in install a SIM card, you actually get a different featured snippet with a different picture. You can try that yourself. I got more examples of that in a minute. Now, this is something I was doing this morning. Literally, I was trying to prepare a Word document to import it into Flare, and I wanted to remove the numbering, the automatic numbering of figures, which has been done using fields. So I wanted to be able to find and replace fields and replace them with nothing. So I just Googled find and replace fields in Word, and I got a featured snippet, which told me exactly what I needed in just 5 steps. And I did actually visit the topic as well. The link to the full topic that it's been extracted from is very useful because it gives you a little bit of additional information, and maybe, I think in this case, I did want one more step. And then another one, literally another one I used today. I was wanting to install the Roboto font on my Windows PC, and I just typed Roboto install Windows, and I got a featured snippet that told me exactly how to do it with a little picture and some related questions. And you notice that the ordinary regular search results have been pushed way down the screen. I'm only seeing 1 or 2 regular search results now. Most of my screen real estate is now taken up with this featured snippet and the related questions. Fastest reptile. So it's not just tasks or procedures, it's facts, it's concepts. Google understands what I mean by combining these 2 words, and it's given me a table of telling me that the bearded dragon is the fastest reptile in the world. Something that I shall find very useful, I'm sure. And you know, of course I was Googling micro content, and I found that if I Googled micro content and Jakob Nielsen's name, then I got a little bit of micro content distilled precisely to give me that bit of information about how he coined the term and what he meant by micro content. A lot of micro content, by the way, is extracted from Wikipedia. And I guess that's just because Wikipedia is a very good, rich, and well-researched source of information. Of course, you don't always get micro content. This is I was kind of hoping register for Mad World Dublin might take me to a short, procedure for how I could quickly nab my place at the upcoming conference in October, but no, turns out it's just a regular set of search results here. But at least I can find the website. Now, as I mentioned, wording is absolutely critical. A lot of you will have heard the news about the first pictures of the black hole, and there's a TV program on BBC TV about black holes recently, so I was kind of really fascinated by them and the size of them, and one obvious query is how big is a black hole. And I get a nice featured snippet that tells me the size of a black hole with a picture. What I found really interesting is that if I change the wording of my question, of my phrase, I get different information. So size of black hole gives me slightly different. It's actually sourced from a different topic, gives me a different picture. I don't think there's any contradiction in information, but it's just a slightly different. It shows how sensitive the algorithms are to the precise wording of what you enter. Interestingly, if you put in dimensions of black hole, which kind of means the same thing, then that sounds like a much more scientific inquiry, doesn't it? So I get a nice table, very scientific table comparing the different types of black hole with the very scientific looking notation. So it's kind of suiting the response to my query or to my phrase. Now, I believe this is an area which is going to continue to evolve, and I'm seeing it with Google. There's a great example of that here. I entered a few terms just to see how it responded, and if you enter a word like perspicacious, I knew I wouldn't be able to say that, then what you get is the dictionary definition as a featured snippet. But look at this. As I typed that in, here we are, this was me typing it in, P-E-R-S-P-I, I'm actually getting, even before I finished typing, a very tiny definition embedded right in the auto-suggest list of things that I might be typing. So I don't know what this might be called, maybe nano content. It's even smaller than micro content. And I think, it's just a move towards bringing people information more quickly. You don't even have to finish typing your search before you're getting the information. And it's really, really short and pithy. And that might be all I need. And the other thing you've probably noticed with Google is these very sort of content-rich panels that appear on the right-hand side of search results. The things at the top were featured snippets. These things down the right-hand side are called knowledge panels. And I think they were originally created mainly for sort of commercial organizations like MadCap, but they are being increasingly used for other more conceptual things, like clock. If you search on clock now, instead of getting a featured snippet, you get a knowledge panel, a very detailed knowledge panel with very rich information and lots of useful links. Some things have both featured snippets and knowledge panels. And here you see the complexity of Google's algorithm, that I've searched on Alsatian, but the knowledge panel has a label which doesn't even match that. But Google's recognizing that Alsatian is a common term used to describe German Shepherd dogs. So it's fascinating, I think, to watch the way Google is adopting this technology, and it's changing all the time. I'm sure these screenshots that I've captured are going to be way out of date in just sort of 3 or 4 months' time. So I shall enjoy looking back on them. Now, the key principle of what we've just seen with Google's micro content, and all those things were examples of micro content. Even the knowledge panels, that's micro content. It's still content that has not been created by Google. It's still distilled out of existing pages. So it's this principle of all micro content is reused from existing, what we might call long form content, the sort of traditional web pages. Nothing's been created by Google. And that's a principle that I think I want to apply when I start creating my micro content in Flare. I don't have to do it that way, but I think it's good to sort of work within the spirit of what Google are doing. So that's a trend I'm going to come back to, or an approach I'm going to come back to in a few minutes' time. Yeah, I think we've already said this, that yeah, we've talked about the way Google detects pages that answer a question and displays the featured snippet in the search results. And you note I pointed out that the featured snippet includes the page's title and URL, so you can actually follow a link to the long form content, which is sometimes useful. All right, let's see how we can do this in Flare. So I've kind of tried to make it seem simple by distilling what we need to do into 4 main steps, which are: number 1, we have to create at least one micro content file. Now, a micro content file is a bit like a glossary file or a variable file, because a micro content file can contain lots of different bits of micro content. So we need only have one micro content file, and we could have lots of different pieces of micro content within that one file. Why might you have more than one? Well, maybe you're using different types of micro content. Maybe you're creating some micro content to use as featured snippets within Flare's search, and we'll see how to do that in a minute. And maybe you've got other micro content which is used specifically for chatbots outside of Flare. So you could keep them separate by having 2 separate micro content files, just like you can have 2 glossary files in Flare. The main difference, though, between the glossary and micro content is because micro content is very rich content. It's actually XHTML based content, then it has to live in the Content Explorer. So when we create these micro content files, they're going to be in the Content Explorer, not in the project organizer. Once we've got our file, we can start adding these what are called phrases and responses. You can think of the phrase as being the question or the search phrase, the thing that the user is typing in, and the response is the information that we're providing in, perhaps in a featured snippet box. And we're going to do that using a new feature of Flare in Flare 2019, called the micro content editor. We can actually, and it's going to be my preferred way of doing it, we can actually add micro content from the topic editor. So actually, I'm going to come back to this in a bit. The best way, I think, to create micro content is when you're looking at a topic and you think, oh, this piece of the topic would be a great bit of micro content. You can identify that micro content and turn it into micro content right from the topic editor, rather than doing it in the micro content editor. But still, we're going to need the micro content editor as well. Anyway, so we've got to create our micro content file. We've then got to add phrases and responses, whichever way we do it. And then there's a couple of other things we've got to do. One is, and these are quite short and simple. One is we've got to decide exactly how do we want to present the micro content result. So what I mean by this is we're going to use something very similar to a featured snippet. We're going to present something in the list of search results right at the top in a box. So we can call it a featured snippet, even though it's not a Flare snippet. It's this Google featured snippet. But we can control the formatting of that. We can control its maximum height and the box that's put around it. And you do all that in the skin. I'm not going to show a lot of that today. It's very simple to do, but it's part of what you'll have to do. And the final thing is, as often with Flare, you haven't quite finished until you've done something in the target. And there is a setting in the target, just a simple checkbox, which means that we will include our micro content in search results, and that will give us this featured snippet type behavior in our search results. So let's go through those steps. The first step was to create the micro content files, wasn't it? Okay, so yeah, just the same way as you create any other file in Flare. What I do is I put my micro content files in resources. So I actually create a folder called micro content, just like I have a folder called images and master pages and snippets. And then within that micro content folder, whichever way you like to create a new file. I sometimes like to right click and choose new. And then this is a new option, micro content. This has been added in Flare 2019. So that tells Flare I want to create a special XML file which will contain micro content. Having created that file, you've then got to edit it. And so what we're seeing here is the contents of a new piece of micro content. So I've actually created a new micro content file called Featured Snippets, because this is micro content I'm going to use for Featured Snippets, not for a chatbot or anything else. I'm going to specifically use it for Featured Snippets. You see the file extension there, FLMCO, and you can see that I've already added a few phrases. So sorry, I didn't show you from scratch. I've already added a few, but how do I add another one? Well, it's very easy. You just click on this little add phrase button. And when you do that, Flare will then add in the new phrase, and you can type in the name of the phrase. Now, what we mean by this phrase is, I suppose it's kind of like a question, but it doesn't have to be a question. The phrase is, if you like, the hook. It's how we're going to try and trap a search query. So the idea is the user's going to search on something, and if they've typed in something where we think a featured snippet would be a good response, then we're going to display that featured snippet. How do we know if the featured snippet is relevant? Well, what we do with this phrase is we try and use words that we think the user might search on. So for example, I've got, here's a good example. How many connections does WSFTP use? If the user searches and uses any of the sort of keywords like connections or WSFTP in their search query, then Flare will see that my phrase is a match, and it will display my the response that I write for this as a featured snippet. So in other words, as long as the user searches on at least one word that I've used in this phrase, then the featured snippet will appear. So if the user searched on elephant, that will trigger this phrase and display the response that I've associated with how to eat an elephant. If they search on Ipswich, it will trigger this one. If they search on contact Ipswich, it will trigger. But they only have to search on one word. Of course, it's likely that you'll have a lot of different phrases, and you might have many phrases that include the name Ipswich. So then it will be important that the user, if they type in contact Ipswich, that will match this phrase. If they typed in support Ipswich or Ipswich support, that would match a phrase that included Ipswich and support. I hope that makes sense. You can also add alternative phrases. Now, this is a bit like adding synonyms, because you can't guarantee, can you, that users are always going to search on exactly the right words. I mean, for example, how many connections does WSFTP use? Well, what if they typed in number of connections? If they type in number of connections, they've used a word, number, which does not occur within how many connections, so that would not be a match to this phrase. So that's a reason why I might want to add an alternative phrase. And if you add an alternative phrase, then that just appears appears in the UI, and you type in your alternative phrase. So in fact, here what I've done, sorry, is typed in an alternative phrase for test. So that the phrases are the hooks. The phrases are what is matched against what the user searches on. But obviously, the phrase is no good unless we provide a good response. and because the response is what's actually going to appear in the featured snippet. So how do we create those responses? Well, we could type in a response using the micro content editor. And if we did that, that would be a piece of micro content that will be used only for the featured snippet. We wouldn't be reusing content which is used elsewhere in our Flare project. So I'm not very keen on that approach. It's not within the spirit of Google's reuse, is it? Google's featured snippets were reusing content which already existed. So what I prefer is if we actually say, look, the featured snippet is just this topic or this snippet that we've already written. So we can just link to something we've already written. The problem is topics tend to be quite long. So that might not be very good. And snippets aren't necessarily going to be complete. They're not going to give a complete answer. We didn't necessarily design snippets to be used as featured snippets. So that's not going to be necessarily perfect. What we can do as well is we can link to a bookmark within a topic or a snippet. And if we do that, then Flare will use as the response the content of that topic or snippet from the bookmark onwards. So that's might be a way of kind of shortening the information a little bit. But my preferred method is the last one, which is that we can link, in fact, to an extract within any existing topic or snippet. And we can precisely define that extract. We can define the beginning and end of that extract. So this is my preferred method, but to do it this way, you're actually going to have to do it from within the topic editor. You actually have to start from the topic editor. So it's a slightly different way of creating micro content from the other methods. If going back to the first three, so these are my least preferred ways, is having created a phrase of test and an alternative phrase of experiment, I can then just type in whatever content I want here. And this is what they call the micro content editor. And it's very similar to the topic editor. It provides most of the same features as the topic editor. I can insert images, I can insert tables, variables. One of the few things I can't do is I can't use the responsive layout editor. And that might be important because I might want a responsive layout within my micro content. And the other thing, which kind of bugs me a little bit, is I can't view the source code. I have no text editor tab at the bottom. And sometimes I do like to go in and tweak the underlying XHTML code. You can't do that in the micro content editor. That's one of the reasons why maybe I'd rather not create my micro content this way. But it's also, more importantly, the fact that I'm not reusing content if I type it in this way. So the other ways were, instead of typing content into the micro content editor, I just click add link beneath the phrase itself, and then I can choose to link to any file, topic file or snippet. And I can also, if I want to, choose a bookmark within any topic file or snippet. And as I say, that will then, instead of showing the whole topic as the response, it will show the topic from the bookmark onwards, which is not perfect, but perhaps better than showing the whole thing. When you do that, and that's what I've done here, I've linked this phrase to a topic called testing the connection. We do see the content previewed in the micro content editor, but it tells me I can't edit it because it's linked to a topic. It's being single sourced from that topic. You can break the link, but that's not a good thing because then you haven't got reuse. So that wouldn't be within the spirit of Google's featured snippets. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. So my preferred method, this is how I like to create my phrases and responses for micro content, is to do it from within the topic editor. So what we're seeing here is a very slightly zoomed in view of the topic editor. I'm working in a topic called multi-part transfers. And this is where I've spotted a bit of content that it would be a great bit of micro content. It's answering the question, how many connections does WSFTP use? So all I've done is I've highlighted that content. I've dragged my cursor over to highlight the precise extent of the information I want from start to finish. So you can see there is topic content above and below it that I'm not using. And then I'm going to click this new button in Flare 2019. And what that does is it wraps a little container around that bit of content. It allows me to type in a phrase to associate that with. So that's my micro content phrase. Notice you can use variables within the phrase. So instead of putting in WSFTP, I've put the product name variable there. And then I can choose which micro content file I'm going to put this new phrase in. So what I'm getting is a new phrase with this chunk of content as my response, but it's linked. It's being reused from the topic. So when I click OK there, this is the result. I now have a new phrase in my micro content file. There's the response, that little chunk of information which I highlighted within the topic. And again, because it's linked, I can't actually edit it here. If I wanted to change that information, I would change it in the originating topic. And I can get to that topic very easily by clicking the link here. There's a link right from the micro content editor back to that source topic. So that's great. Now you could say, well, what I could have done, I suppose, is just turn that bit of content into a snippet. So do create snippet instead of create micro content, and then link to the snippet. But the advantage of doing it this way, creating the micro content this way, is that when the user sees this in the featured snippet, they will actually automatically see a link to the long form topic, which will take them to the source. So they can see that information in the context of the long form topic. Whereas if I'd turned that information into a snippet and linked to the snippet, I wouldn't have got that link. And again, having added that phrase and that linked response, I might well want to go ahead and insert some alternative phrases. And you just do that in the normal way by using the alternative phrase button. So now I've not only got my original question, but these two alternative phrases. And by the way, the alternative phrases don't have any less weight than the original phrase. They're all treated exactly equally by Flare. So it doesn't matter whether user searches on connection count, number of connections, or how many connections, they're all going to give rise to this response that I've created. I mentioned that you can format the featured snippet, and you do that in the skin. So we're just seeing the skin editor here, and there are some new options, some new properties in the skin editor. It's fairly obvious what they are: search micro content response, search micro content response link, and they all control different aspects of the resulting featured snippet. And then finally, there is this option in the target. Just make sure that in the target on the search tab, you have include micro content results selected there, and that will then give you your featured snippets. And I think I ought to just show you this working. So let's go to, this is the output of that help I just created. So if I now say how many connections, that was one of my phrases, wasn't it? So there's my featured snippet with the link to the long form topic that it came from. And again, it shouldn't matter whether I type in how many connections or connection count, or even just count, because the word count occurred within my phrase. So even though the word count doesn't occur in any topics, it still matched my phrase and still gave me a featured snippet. All right, getting towards the end, the last thing I was going to end with is how you can use micro-content outside of Flare. And really all there is to say about this is that if you've created a micro-content file, as you saw me show you, when you build output, when you build your HTML5 output, Flare will include in the output a new folder called micro-content. And inside of that folder, you will find an HTML file for each of your phrase and response combinations. So there's my how many connections does FTP use. And what that is, it's just a file formatted as regular standard XHTML with metadata. If you look in the source, in the metadata, it says it's got the phrases there, how many connections, number of connections, connection count, and then in XHTML format, it's got the content of the response. So a developer would take this, they may need to transform it to the format required for a chatbot or for the context-sensitive help, but it's in a nice, well-structured, clean XHTML format, which is very easy to transform. Last thing I'll just say is MadCap, of course, are using micro-content in their own help, only for featured snippets. They don't have chatbots or frequently asked questions driven by this micro-content. They have 3 types of featured snippets, and interestingly, they're not reusing this content with other regular topics. They have actually created new snippets, which they didn't have before, which they're using as micro-content. And they have 3 types: quick steps, mini landing pages, and related questions. Quick steps are for very specific questions like, how do I create a snippet? Mini landing pages are for more general queries like, I need to know about conditions. And related questions are triggered by more conceptual things like, tell me about styles. And they do use multimedia a lot within these featured snippets, and they use responsive layouts to place the multimedia side by side with text content. And I've just got a couple of examples here. This is if you now search for create snippets in Flare's help, you'll see this featured snippet at the top with a very short step-by-step instruction. Link to the long form content, which they've hand coded, and a little video on the right hand side. This is one of these mini landing pages on conditions. Search on conditions, you'll see a little summary of conditions with links to some of the most important topics within the help, and a video on the right. And this is what happens if you search on styles in searches in Flare's help. You get a list of questions. Again, a featured snippet. So this is a snippet they crafted specifically for the micro-content, which is used only for this purpose, which provides a really nice sort of way of a launch pad for learning more about styles and CSS. So the advantage of the featured snippet is it's bringing this information right up to position 0 and providing a great starting point in response to a very vague query like styles. Whereas before this, they'd have got a lot of search results and it wouldn't have been clear which of those to pick as a good starting point. So it's a really exciting new feature. I think MadCap are using it in a very interesting way. I'd like to see you using it, I think, in the spirit of Google by reusing your long form content. And one thing I didn't mention, but I'll say on my summary page, is that you really should be using analytics, looking at your web logs, looking at records of what people have searched on. If you use Pulse, you can find that out, because that will help you in choosing the best phrases to use as triggers for your featured snippets. That is it. I've come in just under the hour, but I haven't left much time for questions. I apologize for that. I always talk too much. Let's see if there are any. Any
We
good
do have
questions?
quite a few, Matthew.
Yeah, I thought it
That
might
was
be.
terrific. So many great questions, and I just want to mention two real quick reminders before we get to a few. I know we're at the top of the hour. If I think we can take a couple, and if you all can find a few minutes to stay on, we can answer a few, and then whatever we don't get to, we'll follow up with a question and answer. I don't know. There's two slides I just wanted to remind everybody, Matthew, if you wouldn't mind pulling them
Sure.
up.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And then we'll get to some of these fantastic questions. I'm sort of noticing some patterns, and I want to get to the ones, some of the repeat questions that folks have had, because it sounds like I think it's something that everybody would like to know. Just as a reminder, and
Sorry,
Matthew will,
this is the
oh
first one.
yes, no problem. So with the release of Flare 2019, I just want to mention, although the subject today isn't about Zendesk, if any of you have an interest in publishing some or all of your content to Zendesk, and that's going to be your presentation layer for your single source content, we do have a new plugin called the MadCap Connect for Zendesk plugin. So new licenses of Flare, just as a limited time promotion, do get this plugin for free. So contact your sales rep or email sales@madcapsoftware.com to learn about this promotion. Again, it's for new license purchases. You get the plugin for free. So if that's of interest, please reach out to your rep and they'd be happy to help answer any questions or clarify there. And then another reminder is that you have until June 30th to register and save up to $700 on our Mad World conference in Dublin. So October 8th through the 11th, Matthew will be here or be there. So we hope to see you there. If you haven't registered, it'll be lovely. And so you can go to our website and find out about what's being presented, the speakers, sessions, and the discounts for registering by the end of June. Now, few minutes. I want to just, I'm noticing a couple really good questions that I wanted to get to. One is when, you talked about how useful it is to tag existing content in our topics or our snippets rather than sort of
Yeah.
write it new in the editor, and how
Yes.
useful that can be. So one common thing I'm seeing is when you do that, we didn't show it live, but when you tag an element in your topic, maybe a paragraph or a list item or a div or something like that, does Flare wrap it around some kind of marker? And if it does, any changes or additions to that content would then would then automatically transfer over to the micro content file. So, is there that, maybe we can talk a little bit about that connection that happens, because the answer is yes, but I've seen that question come up a couple times, and I thought it would be good to point out that another great benefit of linking to that content is that you only have to maintain it in one place, which is what we always want to
Well,
do.
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, what you're talking about is a risk, I suppose, with any kind of single source thing, that when you have one single source and you change that source, it will affect everything that is using that source. Yeah, the answer to the question is there is a kind of wrapper around it. Let's see if I can just show you that. If I go to the topic that has that wrapper, you can see in the tag bars down the side, it actually says MadCap micro content there. And if I go into the source code, there is actually an XML tag there, MadCap micro content. So that it's just being wrapped around the content that's identifying my micro content. And I can change the markers around. I can do whatever I like. It is just a couple of tags in the content. But yeah, you now have to be aware that anything you do within this section is going to impact your micro content. That's right.
So any change you make here in terms of reordering a list item, for example, would transfer over in your micro content file. So they're
But
connected.
but that's a benefit, because if you need to change something, if you realize you got those list items the wrong way around, you would want them to change in the mic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't want to do it in two places. Another benefit of linking to existing stuff you've written.
Exactly.
Another common thing I'm seeing here is what about conditional tags? So, we can have more than one micro content file in a project. So, maybe, sometimes we may want to use conditions here. So how do they play into these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mentioned you might have 2 or 3 different micro content files. One of them might be micro content you've designed specifically for a chatbot. So in that case, you'd probably apply a condition to that file and then exclude it from your regular HTML5 output, Flare's HTML5 output, if you didn't want it to be used as a featured snippet.
Right. I mean, it sounds like by default they would, all of the micro content files, they would be included unless you
Correct.
chose
Yes.
to conditionally remove
Yes.
them from a particular target.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes. Because there's no. Yeah. I mean, there's no. As far as Flare is concerned, they're just micro content files. There's no notion of micro content being featured snippets micro content, other than the fact that I've given it that name. But any micro content I put in here is potentially going to be appearing in featured snippets if what the user searches on matches the phrase that was used in the micro content.
right. And what about, you know, singular versus plural? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if you've tested any of this, but does any of that have any play? So, you know, I think in one of your
Yeah.
examples you had, you know, connection versus connections, you
Yeah,
know.
I think Flare's own search engine is flexible enough to kind of handle that kind of difference. So I don't think you'll find it matters. It's really just for your own consistency, you probably want to adopt one or the other. But I don't think if the user searches on connections, it will find connection, and vice versa.
Correct. Okay. And then another great question that came up is, you know, does Google have to see my content? Do I have to use Google search, or can I use the built-in Flare search and have this work?
Oh gosh, yeah. This. Even though I talked about Google, because Google kind of blazed the way in terms of using featured snippets. This has nothing to do with Google search. What I'm showing you, this is all MadCap's own search. It works with Elasticsearch and MadCap search, and yeah, it's nothing to do with Google. It's not using any of Google's artificial intelligence. It is just using. It is matching the search queries that users type against our phrases. So it's not really artificial intelligence, but we can, you know, by coming up with good phrases and creative phrases and basing it on our analytics, we can kind of make it behave in an intelligent way and make it look like Google's behavior. But no, it doesn't have to be Google search. It
Okay.
can't be Google search.
Right. Yeah. So our featured snippet in search results works with the Elasticsearch and the default MadCap.
Yeah,
It
correct.
won't, it actually won't work if you choose the Google search engine.
No,
Now, but if you were using it and it was, you know, if Google's algorithm, if your content, I guess, was publicly facing, and
right.
Google's algorithm was thinking the right way, it's really up on to Google at that point. Maybe something in your content could result in a featured snippet
It
in
might
Google
do, and
search engine. Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of search engine optimization companies around who'll you know ask you for lots of money to make your stuff appear in these feature snippets.
Hmm.
There are various techniques you can use by just using rich metadata and just creating good content. But there are techniques you can use that make your content more likely to show up in knowledge panels or featured snippets, but that's completely different from the techniques we've been looking at in today's session.
So another great question for those who are used to using perhaps indexes. Would using, in your opinion, do you think using
Hmm.
micro content would replace indexing, or maybe used in addition to?
I think used in addition to, yeah, I've been using indexing for a while now to improve search because, as I'm sure most of you know, MadCap search does target keywords that you've embedded within topics. So that's a great way of making your search a bit more flexible. So it's not only targeting the visible text, it's actually looking for invisible keywords as well. So I think a combination of micro content phrases, index keywords, and also synonyms. And by the way, the synonym file in Flare does work with the micro content phrases. So for example, if in my silly example, I think I've told Flare that an elephant is a type of mammal. And so if the user searches on mammal, that will bring up the featured snippet on how to eat elephants. So that's the synonyms and the featured snippets working together.
Wonderful. Well, Matthew, we've got some other great questions coming in, and we're gonna keep this question panel open for just a minute. So if you can think of
Sure.
more, please type them in because we won't have time to get to them all. But they're fantastic. So keep them coming for the next few minutes because we'll be compiling all of this for everybody and sending out the answers to everyone that registered. I want to thank you, Matthew, for your time today. This was fantastic. This is such a fun subject, and
It
it
is. I
certainly
agree.
yeah, and I think everybody's excited to put it into practice and tinker and play. So I hope this inspired everybody to think about your content a little bit and put this into practice and try it in the new version. Again, feel free to keep those questions coming for the next few minutes. We'll be sure to answer them all after the fact, and we'll send out that question and answer document. So Matthew, thank you again for joining us. Thanks everybody for attending. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope to see you all on the next webinar. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Yeah, have a
Thank you
great
again.
Easter weekend as well.
Yes, happy Easter, everybody.
Thanks, Jen.
Take care.